Hello everybody, it is Voodoo51292 here with you, and today I'm going to be doing a very special video today, where I am going to attempt to do my best to explain to you all the ending of Bioshock Infinite. I completed the game last night, and the ending of the game is about a 25-minute segment that it completely blows your mind. It boggles you, it baffles you, it befuddles you, it does all kinds of crap to you. And it's extremely confusing the first time you go through the game. And what I'm going to attempt to do in this video is to break it down for you, explain it to you the best way that I can, the best way that I can do, to try to have you understand the ending of the game. I'm also going to talk a little bit about my thoughts about the ending of the game, the implications that it, that it brings up, some of the debate, the conversations that have been ongoing because of the ending. I'm going to give you my thoughts on it. So, just want to say this up front to cover myself that obviously the video is going to contain spoilers because I'm going to be revealing and talking about the ending of the game. So obviously, if you have not beaten Bioshock Infinite yet, please stop watching the video. Do not proceed because the ending of the game will be ruined for you, and then there will be no point to play the game. So, spoilers, I don't want to hear any complaints about it because you've been warned. I'll put it in the description, all that other kind of stuff. Spoilers, alright? So stop watching if you haven't beaten the game. Also, just another note, this is going to be a very long, lengthy video. I already know this because it's going to take me a long time to try to explain everything that happened. So, if you're not in the mood for a very long video, I'm sorry, but this is going to be a long video. So, we're going to begin, alright, by breaking down the ending of the game. Now, I'm going to do my best to try to get the order of events right, because I don't have it written down in front of me or anything. I'm just going off my own memory of watching the ending a couple of times. So, if I get the order wrong or whatever, please forgive me, but I'll do my best. So, where we're going to start is we're going to start at the point, okay, and again, spoilers. We're going to start at the part at the beginning of the ending sequence of the game, when you and Elizabeth are on the Zeppelin and you confront Comstock, okay? And basically it starts off with Comstock, he's talking to Elizabeth, talking about DeWitt and how he's the false shepherd, all this other kind of stuff, and he starts telling DeWitt to, what he basically says is, well, I've been really stupid, I've been trying to fight you, I've been trying to kill you, deter you from coming, when all I had to do was tell Elizabeth the truth. And he's like, Booker, why don't you go ahead and tell her about her finger, tell her about, all that kind of stuff. And you're like, what are you talking about, dude? I don't know what you're talking about. So anyway, he grabs her and it ends up with you grabbing him and you kill him. You bang his head on the fountain and drown him. And Elizabeth starts questioning you. She's like, what did he mean? Tell me about my finger and also like kind of, all this stuff, and you're like, I have no idea what he's talking about. He's crazy. So anyway, you go from there, you go through the final gauntlet of the game, the final combat scene of the game, and once you go through all that, you go to the bow of the airship, and you have the whistle, obviously, that controls Songbird. And you call Songbird in, and he comes and destroys the siphon, which is basically this big contraption that was in Monument Island where Elizabeth was being kept. And basically, you come to find out that the siphon was used to literally siphon off Elizabeth's power so that she was not able to, openly walk through these tears and leave Columbia. Because she tells you earlier on that, hey, I was able as a kid to just open these tears to wherever I wanted to go, but I could never, I always wanted to come back. I never wanted to completely go. Well, really she couldn't because the siphon was limiting her power. Well, when Songbird comes in, he destroys the siphon. Basically, it releases all of her power, and she's able to be, fully powered and has the ability to open tears to wherever and go wherever. And you see her glowing, and she's got all this power. And of course, the siphon blows up, it electrocutes your whistle, and you're like, oh shit, you drop it, and you can't control Songbird anymore, so he flies at you to try to kill you. And Elizabeth goes whoosh and opens up this tear to prevent Songbird from doing that. And when you step through the tear is really the first kind of mind-boggling thing that happens. You step through the tear, and where else are you but the underwater city of Rapture from, of course, Bioshock 1. You're actually in the original hall that you go into in the first Bioshock when you get your first plasmid, when you get Electrobolt. And you pass out and you flip over the thing, and there's the Big Daddy and all that stuff. That's where you are, and you look outside, and basically she's trapped Songbird underwater, outside Rapture, and the water pressure basically kills him, and he dies. And it's kind of a touching moment because Elizabeth and Songbird had this relationship, and Songbird's dead, and you're like, what the hell's going on? We're back in Rapture. What is happening? Well, anyway, of course, Booker has no idea where he is. He doesn't know what the hell's going on. So anyway, you're in that room, and Elizabeth tells you, he's like, what is this? And Elizabeth goes, well, this is it's a door, one of many. And you're like, what are you talking about? So she says, I have to show you. Follow me. So you follow her down the hallway, basically retracing the steps of the very first game. You go out into the area with the bathysphere where it first pops up, and you go into the bathysphere and you activate it. The bathysphere goes up, it shoots out through the ocean, through Rapture, and Booker's like, haha, there's a city underwater, how ridiculous. And you're like, yeah, well, you just spent an entire game in a city floating in the sky, so that was a dumb comment. That's a tangent. Anyway, you go through Rapture, you pop up on the surface of the water, and you head over to the lighthouse. Obviously the lighthouse from the first Bioshock. And you step out, and you go to the door of the lighthouse, and Elizabeth opens the door, and when you pop out, you look out, and the stars, the sky is just full of stars, all these lights everywhere. And Elizabeth is like, oh my god, there's all these doors that are opening at the same time. And Booker's like, all I see is stars, dude. And she's like, no, they're doors. And he's like, okay, whatever. So anyway, you go to the lighthouse, Elizabeth opens the door. You step out of the door, and you see an infinite sea of lighthouses. And you're like, what the hell is going on here? So anyway, this is when stuff starts to get crazy and weird and mind-boggling. Because Elizabeth then basically goes on to tell you that they're not really lighthouses. The lighthouses are just the physical manifestation of what they really are. What they are doors to an infinite number of worlds, hence the title Bioshock Infinite. There's an infinite amount of dimensions, of parallel universes, and these lighthouses basically just represent, they represent what they are, or they're representative of the doors basically to these alternate dimensions. And she says that these alternate worlds they have constants and they have variables. She said you, meaning Booker, myself, Elizabeth, Songbird, all these things are present in these alternate universes, but there's constants, but there's variables. And so obviously that immediately draws ties to Rapture and all that other kind of stuff, whereas, Booker can be viewed as Jack from the first game. Elizabeth obviously could be manifested. More or less she says there's always a man, there's always a city, there's always a lighthouse. So it always starts with a lighthouse, and in all these other worlds, there's always this one man who builds this utopian city. There's always, someone who comes and into the city who opposes the leader. There's always a feminine character that needs to be saving. Obviously, Elizabeth in this game, the little sisters in Rapture. There's always some kind of mechanical beast that serves to protect the female. Songbird, Big Daddies. There's always these magical potions and stuff that gives you supernatural abilities, vigors, plasmids. There's all these constants, but there's variables. I mean, the story isn't always the same. The characters don't always manifest themselves in the same way. There's always variables, okay? So that's a pretty crazy revelation already, right? It's like blows your mind. So So anyway, you continue walking, and you go through one of the another lighthouse door, and you come out the other side, and there's more lighthouses, and you see yourself, Booker, and Elizabeth on other docks or other bridges going between lighthouses, walking as you walk. And Elizabeth explains, I don't exactly know her wording, but she's talking about how, you've already been there, you've already done this, you will do this, you have done this. It's crazy. Basically, you've been everywhere, you've done all this stuff, and you're just like, I don't even know what the hell you're talking about, right? So at this point, you continue to walk, and there is actually 2 paths you can take to 2 different lighthouses. Now, more or less, what these 2 paths, even though there's 2 lighthouses you can go to, they both lead to the same location. And what that's basically symbolic of is the fact that choice in this, universe, choice is really an illusion. Because what Elizabeth is basically saying, and what's revealed about this world, is that for every single decision that you make between option A and option B, every time you make a decision between the 2, automatically there is a parallel dimension that is opened where you choose the opposite of what you chose. So I don't know. For instance, if I were to get a letter of acceptance from a college, no matter what I picked, if I picked to accept and go to that school, there would already be, the second I made that choice, there would be an alternate portal opened up, an alternate dimension where I made the choice to not go, and vice versa. So anytime you make a choice between A or B, there's an alternate reality where you make the opposite choice. So really, choice is kind of an illusion, because it doesn't matter what you choose. There's going to be scenarios in alternate dimensions where you make both choices. So that's kind of what that symbolizes, is that you can go left, you can go right, but you're going to end up at the same place, because, it doesn't really matter what you choose. Choice is an illusion. So anyway, you pick your path, you go through another lighthouse door, and if I'm remembering right, this is where you go to this, you're all of a sudden outdoors at this baptism scene. And you're like, what the hell's going on? And Booker starts talking about how he remembers where they are. And he says that he was at this place after his battle at Wounded Knee, which you find out about in the game, his fight at Wounded Knee. And, he's like, I don't understand. So there's a preacher there. He's actually the same preacher from the beginning of the game, which kind of leads you to believe maybe that wasn't really there. It was just a construct of his mind. But it's the same preacher, and he is talking about baptism. So you have to go up and choose to accept baptism. And basically, what Booker says is that it's basically implying that he was upset about what he did in his previous life, killing people and killing all those Native Americans and doing all this bad stuff. So he basically went to be baptized to, cleanse himself of that. Well, he goes up to accept the baptism, and what happens is he winds up backing out. He does not accept the baptism, okay? Now, keep in mind, as I said, for every choice between A and B, there's an alternate dimension that opens up for if you chose the other option. So at that moment, there is an optional dimension that's opened where he does accept the baptism, okay? And we'll talk about that later on. So anyway, in this dimension, he does not go through with the baptism. There's a door up at the top of a hill, so Elizabeth and he go through that top door. Now when they go through the door, they wind up in Booker's office that you see a couple of times throughout the game. And who is standing there but Robert Lutece. Now, some backstory on the Lutesses here. I need to get a drink. As I said, I need to settle in because this is going to be a long one. This is going to be a lengthy video. I have a lot to discuss here, but I want to be thorough. So the Lutesses. You meet Rosalind and Robert Lutece, and they're sort of a big mystery throughout the whole game. You don't know what's going on with these two. They keep showing up and talking gibberish. You don't know what they're talking about. Well, as you come to find out, of course, that Rosalind Lutece is the scientist. She's the one that basically gave Columbia the ability to float. She also is the one that basically discovered the tears and how to use them and all that kind of stuff, and gave Elizabeth the ability to use these tears. But through the whole game, she's had this twin brother, Robert. Now, what you actually come to find out through audio logs and stuff, if you find them in the game, is that Rosalind and Robert Lutece are really the same person. They are Lutece. They're not two different people. They're the same person from alternate dimensions. And through the audio log, it basically reveals that they were playing with the same atom, the same particle or something in their two dimensions. It was the exact same atom. And somehow by doing that, they discovered, the tear and all that stuff, and they were able to communicate with each other through some type of Morse code, and ultimately found a way to open up the tear and to bring the male Lutece into the Columbia dimension. And anyway, because in order basically to cover that up and to explain it, the female, Rosalind Lutece, basically claimed that Robert was her twin brother, when in reality, they're the same person from alternate dimensions, okay? So anyway, we're just going to refer to them as Lutece from here on out, because they're really the same person. So when you go into the office, Lutece is there, and you tell Elizabeth, this is the guy that hired me to come get you from Columbia. And you're like, oh wow, really? There's a side door that you go into in your office, and when you go in there, there's a crib with a child in it. And you're like, Booker's like, I don't understand. I don't remember any baby. I had no child. This doesn't happen. And Lutece is standing at the doorway, blocking the way out. And Elizabeth is like, you gotta give, it's a baby girl. She's like, you gotta give her to Lutece. And he's like, I'm not doing that. There's no way. And Elizabeth basically says, listen, you can sit here all day, well, it's really not a day, because they're in dimensional space or whatever, but she said, you can wait here as long as you want, but in the end, you have to give the child to Lutece. It has to end that way. And he's like, how do you know this? And she's like, because I can see all the doors. Since I have this power, I can see all the dimensions. I can see what's behind all the doors, and I know that in every dimension, it winds up that you lose this child. And we'll come back to that again and explain that as we get to the end, but he's like, okay, well, I guess I don't have a choice then. So he gives the baby to Lutece, and they go away. Well, after that, you go through, and again, I hope I don't get the order wrong. I'm going to try my best to remember, but he goes through another door, and I think at that point, he goes back to the canoe, the rowboat from the beginning of the game, on the water, and headed towards the dock, to go into the lighthouse. And they get there, and basically they talk a little bit, and then they keep on walking to the lighthouse again. They go through the door to the lighthouse, and now they are at an alleyway where you have a... Oh, I forgot to mention one key point, by the way. When he gives the child to Lutece, Lutece then says, Mr. Comstock washes you of all your debt. So basically what you come to find out is that Lutece was working for Comstock. You basically sold the baby to Comstock through Lutece, and the baby is Anna. It's revealed to you that that's who the baby is. Anna is your child. So anyway, back to what I was talking about. You go through the lighthouse, you're in this alleyway, and you see a much younger Comstock holding Anna. And there's the two Luteces standing on either side of a tear talking to one another. And basically it's a tear between Booker's dimension and the Columbia dimension. And you run up there, you change your mind, you try to grab Comstock and take Anna back. Well, it's too late when you get there, and Comstock goes through the portal, and you're still fighting, and the portal starts to close, and it goes in slow motion, and as it finally closes up, Anna's finger, the baby's finger, gets caught in the portal, and her finger gets chopped off, okay? And at that point is when you realize, you understand that the baby, Anna, your child, is Elizabeth. You basically, in your dimension, you sold your child to Comstock through Lutece, who then took Anna back to Columbia and raised her as Elizabeth, okay? So that's kind of a huge deal, is that, you know, your child is Elizabeth, and then at that point, every single sexual joke that you've made in the entire game about Elizabeth comes off as horribly messed up, because you basically have been talking about wanting to do things to your daughter. So anyway, there's that moment, okay? And then at that point, I forget if there's another door or something, but they go through another, you know, portal, whatever, back to Booker's office. And at this point, you know, you're in Booker's office, and you're crying about Anna, and you can't believe what you did. You hold up your hand, and you see that you have that AD scratched into your hand, which you had from the very beginning of the game. And at that point, you realize that it's the initials Anna DeWitt that's on your hand. And so, at that point, Elizabeth is talking about how, you know, how Anna's gone, and, you know, there's no way to get her back until somebody showed up and gave you an opportunity. And at that point, a tear opens up, and it's Lutece again, and it's a tear back again to the beginning of the game, to the dock with the rowboat. And so you go in it, and you know, you go through on the boat, you get up to the dock, and you're basically talking, you don't understand, because you're like, listen, we killed Comstock. We killed him, he's dead. Why are we looping? Why are we going back again to where I have to go save my daughter again? And Elizabeth basically explains, you really think he's dead? Because, you know, we thought that Chin Lin was dead. We thought that Lady Comstock was dead. But you saw that in alternate dimensions and stuff, they were still alive. And the fact of the matter is that Comstock, just because we killed him in one dimension, doesn't mean anything. Comstock still exists in millions upon millions upon millions of dimensions, because you got to think about this. Ever since Comstock was born, every single decision that he's made has split him into two different parallel universes. So just think about that. Through Comstock's entire life, every decision that he's made, he's been split off into a different universe. So he exists in basically an infinite number of universes because of how many times that there's been splits with him. And just because you kill him in one dimension, it means nothing when he exists in so many others. So, more or less, Booker decides that, well, that means that the only way that we can permanently be rid of Comstock is if we kill him as an infant, really before he makes any choices to split himself. We have to kill him in his infancy. We have to smother him in the crib, is what he says. And, you know, Elizabeth says, well, yeah, you're right. So they keep going. They wind up back at the lighthouse again, the third time, the lighthouse that you went up to in Columbia. And Elizabeth turns to you and she basically says, you know, are you sure this is what you want? And Booker says, yeah, I have to do this, you know, to spare you what I put you through. And she says, okay, and it's symbolic at this point because Booker then takes Elizabeth's hand off the door and he opens the door with his own hand, basically symbolizing the fact that he is now making the decision as to where they go, what dimension that they go to. She's not anymore. So he opens the door and he's back at the baptism with the preacher. And what happens is he turns to Elizabeth and he says, I don't understand. You know, we're back here again. You know, how is this going to help me? I've already been here. And she looks at him and says, no, this is not the same place that we were. Basically, she says that this is like the baptism of baptism, when you made the choice, you know, between accepting the baptism or walking away from it. And as you're looking at Elizabeth, all of a sudden, all these other Elizabeths start walking in from different dimensions. You know, again, where Elizabeth was split into different dimensions based on what happened to her and her decisions. And basically they explain that what happens is that, again, there's two worlds, or two dimensions. There's a dimension in which Booker accepts the baptism. There's a dimension in which Booker rejects it. In the world that Booker, or the dimension I should say, that Booker rejects the baptism, he stays as the Booker that we've been playing with, that we know and love, that we've been playing with through the whole game. He rejects the baptism, he continues on with his life, and instead of finding his you know, instead of cleansing his conscience through baptism, he turns to gambling, that kind of stuff. That's how he winds up accruing his debt that he has to then sell his daughter to pay back. But in the other dimension where he accepts the baptism, what happens is he's born again as a new man, and he adopts the name Zachary Comstock, and Booker becomes Comstock. And that's really the huge revelation of the game, and you understand at that moment that you have to be killed before you ever make a decision on the baptism, regardless of what decision you make, because as soon as you make one decision, an alternate world exists where you've already made the other decision. So if the decision happens with the baptism, there will always be a world that exists where Comstock exists. And so he realizes that he has to be killed before he makes that decision, so he gives into it, and he allows the Elizabeths to drown him right there and kill him. And as that happens, the camera zooms away, and you see all of the Elizabeths begin to vanish one by one until there's one left. The final piano key strikes, and the screen turns to black, indicating that she's gone as well. So, what that basically means is that once that happens, once Booker is drowned, before he makes a decision on the baptism, at that point he erases all existence of Comstock, because he's dead before he ever makes that decision, so Comstock never exists. So every single world where Comstock exists, he's no more. And what that means is no Comstock, no Columbia, and unfortunately what that means is kind of a sad note, but what it means is that the Elizabeth that we've grown to know and love throughout the campaign of Bioshock Infinite also never existed, because Elizabeth was who she was because Comstock kidnapped her, and she grew up in Columbia and was given the ability to use tears and all that kind of stuff. Well, if there's no Comstock, there's no Columbia, there's no Elizabeth in the way that we know her. And that means that all the adult forms of Elizabeth, all the forms that we know, disappear. They don't exist anymore. And it's gone. So basically what it means is that the whole campaign and everything that you just played never happened once Booker is drowned. And if you go through the credits, there's one final little scene at the end there where you're back in your office. You go through that door where the crib was, and you say, "Anna, is that you?" And you go, and there's a crib there. And the game cuts to black. And basically what that's implying is that you've erased, you stopped the infinite loop, you stopped Comstock, and now you're just in a dimension where it's you and Anna, and you just live happily forever after. There's no Columbia, no Comstock, no Elizabeth in the way that we've known her. She's now just Anna, and she's going to be whoever she's going to be being raised, you know, on Earth. So, a lot of stuff that happened. Let me check my time, see how long that took me to explain. Almost 30 minutes. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to stop recording, I'm going to come back, you're going to see a jump cut, and I'm going to continue the video. Alright everybody, I'm back. So, I just got through explaining and basically breaking down the entire ending of Bioshock Infinite. But there's some other things to talk about, some things to go back and touch on and clarify, okay? So first of all, one of the things that we find out from all of this is that basically Booker has been stuck in an infinite loop for at least 100 times of going through what we went through in the whole campaign of the game, having to go to Columbia, do all that kind of stuff. He's been stuck in an infinite loop, doing that for hundreds of times, and let me explain. It all harkens back to the experience he has in that room where Elizabeth tells him that in the end he has to give up Anna. And what people might be asking and wondering is they might be saying, well, you're saying that there's a dimension for every choice. So wouldn't that then imply that there's a dimension that exists in which Booker does not sell Anna and that they stay together and none of this ever happens? Well, the answer to that question is no. There may be a dimension in which he does not sell Anna, but there is no dimension that exists, at least as far as Comstock is concerned, where Booker and Anna stay together. Let me explain. One of the things we learned through audio logs and stuff like that through the game is that Comstock actually is sterile because of advanced contact with the Lutece's machinery and stuff like that, and the tears and all that stuff. He actually is sterile. He cannot have children. And to go along with the whole purity, you know, vein that the game flows in, he needs an heir. And it has to be somebody of his own blood, because he's so obsessed with this purity and all this other kind of stuff. It has to be his own blood heir. So what he decides is that he's going to go into this other world where Booker does not become Comstock, and he's going to basically steal Booker's daughter, who's really his daughter, because Comstock and Booker are the same person. So he makes a decision, he's going to go steal her. So basically what happens is that in one dimension, obviously, he becomes Comstock. And in all those dimensions, Comstock obviously comes back and takes Elizabeth. But the other route, where he does not become Comstock, he winds up selling Elizabeth. Now, there could be a dimension, and there, I would assume, is a dimension in which Booker does not sell Anna. But because Comstock wants Elizabeth so badly to be his heir, what we assume to happen is that even if he doesn't sell Anna, Comstock still comes into his dimension and forcibly takes her with him. So no matter what dimension we're talking about, wherever Comstock exists, there is no possibility of Booker and Anna staying together, because either he's going to sell her to Comstock, or if he doesn't sell her, Comstock's come and take her anyway. So, and again, we already mentioned that Comstock is always going to exist as long as Booker, you know, is alive, basically. As long as Booker goes and makes a decision on the baptism, Comstock's always going to exist. So as long as Comstock exists, he's going to wind up with Anna/Elizabeth. So the answer to that is no. He has to give up the child. There's no ending, there's no way in which himself and Anna stay together as long as Comstock is still alive in a dimension, okay? So I know that's confusing, but I hope that I clarified that. So basically the point is that until he defeats Comstock, he is stuck in an infinite loop where he has to continuously go and rescue his daughter. And he goes through the infinite loop, he winds up back at the baptism, and we assume that every point up until this point, he's decided to make a decision on the baptism. And every time he makes a decision, Comstock is created, okay? So, you know, again, we saw that going through the ending sequence that basically Lutece came and opened up a portal, and what we assume is that Lutece, can we call it it, basically screwed a bunch of stuff up, because it was playing around with science and stuff like that, and everything was hunky-dory, but then they opened up a tear, and made it possible to travel across dimensions, and when they did that, they screwed everything up, and again, they made it so that Booker and Anna could never be together. So the implication here is that Lutece feels remorse about that and wants to try to correct the timeline, and so what he does is that he comes into, he opens a tear and offers Booker the opportunity to, he basically implants a new idea in Booker's mind. He brings him into the new dimension, the dimension of Columbia, where Comstock is and all, and he basically, they explain in the game that when you go between dimensions and stuff like that, you start replacing the memories of what you know with other memories. So basically, he brings Booker into the Columbia dimension, and Booker, in his mind, replaces his memories with other stuff, and so in his mind, it's a new purpose. It's no longer I'm going to save my daughter or whatever. It's oh, I have to go get this other girl to erase my debt. He doesn't know it's her daughter. He doesn't know any of that stuff. He doesn't remember any of the stuff that happened. He replaces it with new memories of, this is the job or whatever. And the idea is that Lutece is basically trying to correct stuff. He's trying to bring Booker with him to go get Elizabeth to end all this craziness. But as long as he continues to make a decision at that baptism scene, Comstock is still going to exist, and he's still going to continuously be in this loop of getting brought back to the same dimension to try to rescue his daughter. And the way that we definitively know this is there's a scene very early on in the game, and of course you have no idea what it is when the game starts. You don't know until you beat it, but there's a scene when you run into the two Luteces, and they have a coin, and the male Lutece is wearing this chalkboard with heads and tails, and you realize that there's like over 100 marks on the head side and 0 on the tails, and they give you the coin and tell you to flip it. You flip the coin and it's heads. So basically it's saying it's always heads, and what that's saying is that this is the exact same dimension that Booker has been through over 100 times. As many times as there's marks on that heads, that's how many times Booker has been through this. And it's the same dimension, because remember, there's going to be 2 dimensions. One dimension where it's heads, one dimension where it's tails. And because of the fact that we can tell that it's been heads that many times, it's proof positive that he's going through the same dimension, the same exact dimension where everything is already scripted, It's a dimension where all decisions have already been made, and it's the dimension. He's basically in the same dimension where it's always heads, if that makes sense. There's a dimension for heads, a dimension for tails, but he keeps going through the exact same one because he's stuck in an infinite loop until he completely eliminates Comstock. He is stuck in this infinite loop, and that's the coin flip thing is what proves that. Okay. And it's really, it's crazy. It's mind-boggling, it's mind-bending, it's mind-exploding, really. But when you kind of wrap your head around it and you kind of start to understand what's really going on here, the fact that, basically the whole thing is an infinite loop, all relating back to the baptism moment where, he makes a choice one way or another. As soon as he does that, Comstock is going to exist. And therefore, as long as Comstock exists, he's always going to have to give up his daughter. There's no ending where he doesn't give her up. And because of that, as long as Comstock exists, he gives up his daughter. He's stuck in this infinite loop of trying to go and rescue her. And she always leads him back to the baptism. But, we assume that this time is the first time in over 100 times where he just, for whatever reason, he understands finally that he's got to be killed at that moment or it's never going to end. And the first 100 times or so that he did it, he got to that baptism moment and he made a decision anyway. And we saw that. It was proof because the first time you visit that baptism thing at the end of the game, he makes a decision. Remember, he rejects the baptism. When he does that, he goes from there to his office where he has to give up the baby. And then the tear opens up where he goes through back to Columbia. So we see the loop beginning to repeat. And it's not until he goes to the lighthouse and says, and takes Elizabeth's hands away and opens it with his own hand to say, I have to end this, that he's able to go back to the baptism and kill himself. Because what we're seeing that first time is the loop beginning to repeat. He makes the decision, meaning that, once again, he makes a dimension in which Comstock exists, so he goes back, he has to give up his daughter, and the Luteces come to open up a tear to give him an opportunity to go get her again, and the loop is starting over, but finally he puts an end to it by taking matters into his own hands, opening the lighthouse into his own world, and, you know, into the dimension that he wishes, and killing himself, and it ends it, okay? So, it's very confusing, it's very convoluted. I really hope that I did my best, okay, to try and explain it the best way I can in kind of a three-part series of you know, as long as Comstock exists, he has to give up his daughter, and if he gives up his daughter, he has to be stuck in this loop to go save her. That's really the basics there. But despite all that, this opens up a lot of questions of people between the obvious connections between Bioshock Infinite and the first two Bioshocks with Rapture, okay? So I'm going to talk, I'm going to spend some time talking about that now. So, basically, there's a lot of theories out there. I have my own theory. There's no right or wrong theory because Irrational or Ken Levine hasn't come out and definitively said this is the way it is, and I doubt they ever will, because I think that the whole point of this ending was to encourage debate and conversation amongst people because it makes it fun. So some of the theories going on is that, in fact, you know, because of the parallel dimensions and all this stuff, that Booker, who is Comstock, is also Andrew Ryan, and therefore Jack. So there's this theory out there that all four of them are really the same person. Now, they support this argument because they say that that basically, if you remember back to the first Bioshock, that after the bathyspheres are locked down for use from the general public, only Andrew Ryan or people with very similar genetic code to Andrew Ryan can operate the bathyspheres, okay? The general public cannot use them anymore. And if you notice, when you go back to Rapture and Bioshock Infinite, there are signs up already that say that the bathyspheres have been shut down, meaning that supposedly only Andrew Ryan or somebody very close in genetic code could use the bathyspheres. And what happens is that Booker goes in and he uses the bathysphere, which people basically are interpreting to say that, you know, he has the same or very similar genetic code to Andrew Ryan and Jack, meaning that he's basically them in an alternate world. But detractors of this, they say that, well, it can't be, because if these are really parallel times and they're all going on, you know, at the same time, the times are linear, that there's an age gap there. Because remember, Bioshock Infinite takes place in 1912. Rapture wasn't built until like 1940, and Jack didn't show up until, you know, he didn't show up until, I guess it was probably around like the 60s or 70s is when Jack showed up. It was after 1960. So it's probably somewhere in the 60s, and they're saying that there's this age disparity. If the timelines are parallel, you know, that it couldn't, the age difference couldn't be, okay? But the question is, well, why does that matter? Because as we've already seen, you can jump time. I mean, in Columbia, Booker is Comstock, he's really old, you know, but he's also really young, so in that sense, does it really matter that there is an age gap? I mean, you know, who knows? He exists in the same dimension as both, you know, as both young and old. Well, not young, but, you know, in like his 40s and old as Comstock. So can we really put an age, you know, restriction on it? Say, well, the ages wouldn't match up. Yeah, but, you know, I guess what they're saying is that if you were to line the two timelines up like this parallel, that, you know, it's really hard to explain, obviously, because we're talking about abstract stuff here, but basically that, you know, I don't know, I can't really put it into words, but basically they're just saying that if you line the timelines up parallel, that the ages don't sync with each other. And it's complicated to think about and all that other kind of stuff, but so there's people who believe that all four of them are the same person, and there's other people that believe that they're they're separate entities. Now, I'm going to tell you my theory on it, and this is what I believe, and again, there's no right or wrong, but this is how I view it, okay? I view it as there are millions and millions of different worlds, okay? And that within each of these worlds, there are multiple dimensions for the characters and the paths that these characters take. So, for instance, there is a world of Booker and Columbia and all this other kind of stuff that exists, and there's multiple dimensions within that. So, again, for every decision that every person makes, so basically, there's an infinite number of dimensions within this world. And I believe that it is separate from the world of Rapture. So I don't believe that Booker and Comstock are the exact same identical person to Andrew Ryan and Jack and all this other kind of stuff. What I think is that, as Elizabeth says, there's multiple, you know, infinite number of worlds with constants and variables. So what I think it really is I think that it's a version of the same story, the same type of story being played out in a different world, the world of Rapture. What I mean by that is, you know, as she said, there's always a man, there's always a city, there's always a lighthouse. So the way I'm viewing it is that there's all these worlds, and within all these worlds you have a man who builds this utopian city. There is always someone who comes in who is in some way related to this person. Of course, in Bioshock Infinite, it's the same person. In Rapture, it's his son. Okay, so in some way they're related to to these people, and that, you know, that they have to come into this city. They are opposed to the man in charge of the city. There's always a feminine character that needs to be saved. Elizabeth in one, the Little Sisters in the other, and it's kind of cool because if you look, Elizabeth and the Little Sisters are basically dressed the same. They both wear the blue and white outfits, and I think that that's a direct correlation between the two, obviously. You know, there's always these, you know, Big Daddies and Songbird. There's always Plasmids, Vigors. There's always some form of each person in an alternate world. So you can either continue to draw the comparisons, because you've got Frank Fontaine, who can be directly drawn to Jeremiah Fink of Columbia. They're both the manufacturers, the guys who control, like, the Vigors or the Plasmids. They're in charge, more or less. You know, they're in charge of the industry in their areas. Of course, Fontaine's alternate personality, Atlas, is very similar to Daisy Fitzroy in Columbia. How they're both leaders of rebellious groups, you know, that go and ultimately fight the people in charge, and ultimately lead to the destruction of the city. We saw that at the end of Infinite, how Columbia was basically being burned to the ground because the Vox were fighting Comstock. Of course, Rapture, we all know the story, how the Fontaine's army basically fought with Andrew Ryan's troops, and there were splicers, and that led to the destruction of the city. We can see a comparison between Tenenbaum and Lutece. They're both the scientists. Tenenbaum obviously was responsible for discovering the plasmids and how to use them. She watches over the female characters, the little sisters. She's in charge of them. In Columbia, Lutece, she's the scientist. She discovers how to float the city, how to create the tears, and she's basically the one who's in charge of and looking after the female character, who is Elizabeth. So it's like the same versions of characters exist in all these different worlds as constants, but there's variables. Obviously, they're not all the same character. They're not always presented in the same way, like multiple little sisters and multiple big daddies to one Elizabeth and one Songbird. The stories are different, the environments are different, there's variables. But the characters and the way that the story, plays out in each of these worlds are constants. And I think that everything was hunky-dory before that. All these different worlds and these dimensions within each world were going on parallel, fine, unbeknownst of one another. But what really happened was the Luteces screwed everything up because they found a way to jump dimensions, which probably wasn't really supposed to happen, you know what I mean? And they screwed all that up. And they have, invented the ability to not only jump between dimensions in the same world, like, the dimension of Booker becoming Comstock or Booker, staying Booker, but as we saw from being able to jump to Rapture, they have the ability to jump between worlds as well. So they really kind of screwed everything up. But, so my thinking is that in the original Bioshock, the story of Jack, Andrew Ryan, and all that was one dimension. I don't believe that Jack was Andrew Ryan because, it's pretty clear. They say Jack or Andrew Ryan had the affair with I think Jolene was her name, the female dancer. That they had Jack, and then he was conditioned at birth, and had these false images, his false memories placed in his head, and he comes back and kills Andrew Ryan. I don't think that it was the same deal as this. I don't think that he jumped dimensions and that he really was also Andrew Ryan. I don't believe that. I think that what we saw in the original Bioshock played out exactly as we saw. Basically, there was one dimension, because we never hear in Bioshock 1 or 2 any mention of the fact that of tears or alternate dimensions or anything, so we have to assume that in the world of Rapture, they didn't know anything about tears. They didn't know anything about that. And, if everything was connected, meaning that it was all just one world and we didn't have these separate worlds, you would have to figure that they would know about tears, that people would be coming in through tears and stuff like that. But we never hear anything about that. We never see that. We never get any indication. So my only thinking is that, we played, all the other dimensions existed, but what we played in the first Bioshock was one single dimension where everything played out the way that it played out, all the decisions were the same. But there were alternate dimensions, like when you had to decide to save or kill the little sisters, when you made that decision, if you saved a sister, there was also a dimension in which you harvested that sister, but you didn't know anything about it. You couldn't travel because in the world that Rapture is contained in, there was no ability to travel between dimensions. However, that changed in the world of Columbia because the Luteces figured out a way to jump. And that's why, basically the whole story is that time travel, jumping between dimensions, screws everything. Because they did that, they opened up the tear, and then they stuck this poor Booker DeWitt in this endless loop that could only be solved by him having to kill himself. And that's why we got the story of Bioshock Infinite, as opposed to the story of Rapture, because, again, in Rapture, there was no interdimensional jumps that we have to assume. Now, I know that, there's still the question of how did he operate the bathysphere, was that done on purpose, or was it just a slight oversight that they weren't really thinking about? I don't know. It could be the fact that because he wasn't exactly Jack or Andrew Ryan, but that he was basically their version in an alternate world, that the DNA or whatever, the signature could be read anyway, because even though he wasn't the same exact person, he was just a version of that person being played out in another world, so that it recognized him as Jack. I don't know. There's also the symbolism, obviously, of Jack gets into Rapture by going through a lighthouse, and as we saw in Infinite, that going through a lighthouse kind of symbolizes going through an alternate world. So did Jack, when he opened that lighthouse, was he going into an alternate dimension? We really don't know, because it's not explained. But but I tend to think no, because if you remember at the beginning of the game, Booker goes into the lighthouse and winds up going to Columbia. He didn't go through dimensions when he went through the lighthouse. He went through dimensions before that. He went through a tear into that dimension, and the lighthouse was just simply a means to get to Columbia. So I kind of think it's the same deal with Jack. I think that he didn't go through dimensions, because I think that in order to jump dimensions going through the lighthouses, you have to know about the dimensions, and you have to have a want to go through, because we saw that with Booker. When he went through the lighthouse to basically kill himself at the baptism, he wanted to do that. Elizabeth basically kind of made the dimensions as she went opening doors, but I think if you don't have any knowledge of the dimensions, that you can't, you can't go through them through the lighthouse. So I don't think that was the case. I think Jack, he went through the lighthouse, and he didn't jump dimensions that way. He just went through the lighthouse and literally just went down and went into Rapture. I don't think that there was any dimensional jump there. Like I said, I think what played out in the first Bioshock is what played out in that dimension, in that world. There wasn't anything crazy going on there. But it wasn't Infinite, because again, the Luteces screwed everything up by having the ability to jump dimensions, which, as we saw, just really screws things up. So I don't know. Like I said, there's no right or wrong answer, because we don't have a definitive ending or anything like that, and I don't think we ever will. But I'm really excited to see. I would assume, I don't know though, if they're going to continue to make Bioshocks, because with that they could make an infinite amount, literally, of utopian cities and stuff like that. For you to play. I don't know, obviously the story and the plot won't really be the same, because you'll know what you're doing the whole time. You'll already know you're in some kind of rift. I don't know. But they could continue it, definitely, the series, and anything Ken Levine designs I'm going to buy, because I thought it was brilliant. I thought it was a brilliant end. I thought that the creative genius and stuff that went into this was unbelievable and so well thought out. It was fantastic. And so yeah. Thank you. If you watched the whole video, thank you very much. I appreciate it. I know it was really long-winded. I hope that I was able to explain the ending to you guys in a way that you're able to kind of understand if you were massively confused about it at first. I hope that you guys like my theory on what I really think is happening between Rapture and, I've seen these discussions on forums, but I haven't seen anybody on YouTube or anything make a video talking about what they think about the connection with Rapture and all that. So I wanted to do that. And certainly, I would love for you guys to comment on the video. Let me know what your thoughts are about any of this, because again, you can't be wrong or right, because we don't have any definitive ending. So I'd love to hear what you guys think. Do you think that Booker and Comstock and Ryan and Jack are all the same person, or do you kind of think along more of the lines that I'm thinking of, or what do you think? I want to know. I want to hear your opinions. I'm very interested to hear what other people think. So